Hi everyone, Shade Raven here. I'm going to do a little instructional video related to what will be coming out with the Drag and Drop series. In this case, looking at the familiars that come as an option to the Drag and Drop Alchemist. So the Alchemist class, one of the things they can do um, at any point, they can pick up the feat known as Alchemical Familiar, where they kind of out of their own materials, reagents, and a bit of their blood create a familiar based on um, what they can do as sort of an alchemist. And I'll take a look at creating a character sheet you can import that'll be available with the Alchemist drag and drop module that you can pick up from the Forge here pretty soon and make use of that for those of you that like to use a full character sheet for things like the familiars and companions. So first, going over that, I'll just do a quick note on how to get this. You'll go to characters, and in the character selection window, there's a little down button here in the lower right that says import character. I'm not going to click that now because I have just a ton of campaigns and some of these little projects I got going, and you would just see just a messy list of all the different stuff that can be pulled in. But we would hit that. You'll be able to see in that option if you have the drag and drop alchemist module that you'll see an alchemical familiar available. To import, there'll be a little plus button next to that lets you pull it onto the character selection window, and then that'll allow you to have a character sheet now that represents the alchemical familiar. It just occurred to me looking at this that it probably really isn't an animal, although most of the familiars will be like that. Um, it doesn't really say what it is. It'll definitely still follow the rules of tiny and minion with other things. I guess that's sort of up for debate, but looking at this, it really doesn't seem like it's an animal. Although if you'll notice, uh, in the aspects of this creature, it does follow um, all the other rules for a familiar, and that's what we're going to go over here too. Uh, that it's they have abilities and such that come with familiars, and we want to make sure that that's reflected on the character sheet that you'd be using for this familiar. So other than the simple things like when you pull it in, changing the name if you want to name your familiar, maybe giving a portrait and a token for it, what you really want to make sure is that the abilities, armor class, hit points, and things like the skills all reflect what the character should have. Now when it comes to familiars, and you'll be able to see here in the notes for the different familiar rules, they have a bunch of properties that are reflected on the familiar based on the quote unquote master that summons it or otherwise bonded to it. And these are all kind of listed in here. Again, sort of up for debate about the alchemist. It does say it's a tiny animal, so I'm having that in there. Um, and someone will be able to update and let me know if there's is some sort of ruling out there, or if they said that an alchemical familiar does not take on an animal trait. But the rest of the stuff does apply, and that includes things like the modifiers and armor class. Now, if you look at normally when you look at a familiar, it says um, they use the spell casting ability modifier charisma for classes without a spell casting ability. Now, alchemists don't have it, but if you look at the alchemical familiar, it does down here say that you use intelligence modifier to determine its perception, acrobatics, and stealth. Now, what we really want to do, because all of these things, modifiers and armor class, are the same as the uh, the bonded character, and the easiest way to get all of that to work is to simply come in and look at the the base character and set the familiar's stats to that. And this will then allow things like skills and stuff, especially, I mean, they only have the couple that they start with, which is all familiars get acrobatics and stealth. But you'll be able to, there'll be options to allow you to give, a familiar more skills that they can add to it. And they'll still follow the same rules that they'll be using um, the modifiers of the base character. So in this case, the easiest way to do that is to come in here and use the mouse wheel and use the control key to kind of scroll up. Now a lot of these, like dexterity is important because it is reflected in armor class, and we'll go over that here in a second. Certainly because we know the intelligence is being used for this as a spell casting class. So in that case, for certain initially you want to have those two things set so that they will come through here. But they're also going to be sharing things like fortitude, reflex, will saves. Now obviously we're already using dexterity for the armor class, but you'll need to match wisdoms so that those will have the same saving throws. I'll go over that in a little more detail in a second. As well as your fortitude save, in this case would be 12. Now one of the things we're going to go over right next, because we're getting this to match up the modifiers here, so we can see that when they're coming up to use an acrobatics, it's now using the intelligence of +4, so that it has a +7 here. Same way with stealth and your perception, so they gain those benefits from the alchemist using its intelligence modifier for those skills in armor class. It's also important to note that when you change constitution, it also changes how many hit points it's going to be getting as a bonus. And I'll go into that. One of the ways to get a non-classed character to have hit points per level is to simply come in, and these two aspects is how I manage it. One is I create a class up here in the class and level magnifying and just typed in familiar, and that gives it just sort of a generic one. It's not going to follow any of the rules, not going to pull in any of the kind of tracker data and stuff like that and try to adjust a character based on that. And we don't really want that because it's obviously not following any class structures. But what this does is allows us to set a level that can then be used in other aspects, including as you improve, this familiar's level should go up with it, so that things like the armor class, saving throws, skill uses will improve. So you'll notice if I change this to a +2, its hit points have changed, its armor class has changed, fortitude, and its skills will have changed to reflect, like it's normal with a character, the improvements in all of these abilities based on level. But the reason you'll notice down here is that this now seems to be out of whack, because they're supposed to be getting 5 hit points for each of your levels, is because as soon as I added in a +2 to cons to make sure that fortitude save was going to be accurate, it changed what is the 5 hit points per level that I've put in here, and that's just using the control key with the mouse wheel to scroll up and down here to add and subtract points to it, and it's set at base 5 to reflect that. But as soon as you change constitution, it's now going to add calculate in the hit points per level based on constitution. So when you add something to constitution here, it'll be important to change the hit points to make sure that that reflects the accurate update to how many hit points per level they get, because this doesn't change based on your constitution. The familiar always gets 5. There is some familiar abilities to let you add to that, and that you would come in here to use with this level plus and minus, but those are daily selection, so that can be taken, added day to day. There is one that says familiars get 2 extra hit points per level, one of the abilities you can select. And when you would do that, you would come up here, hit the little magnifying glass on the hit points section, put a 2 in there, and then that would then update the character to now have its 5 plus 2 per level. So a second level familiar would now have 14. I'm going to change this back to 1, and you can see if you had selected that in the back, it would then add this modifier as appropriate to there. But we'll go over how you select those powers on a daily basis for your familiars using the actions selection section. But for now, I want to go over just a few more things here so it's pretty clear in how we got to this. Speed is base 25. They get low light vision, but they do gain other things, including an empathetic link that allows you to sense emotions to a mile away. But there's also other familiar abilities that can be selected from day to day that changes what they can do. Some different senses and stuff that can be added. The same way with speeds, but because that's done on a day-to-day basis, no real reason to do this unless you were like absolutely sure you wanted to have that 100% of the time. Or like with other familiars, if you choose an owl, they're always going to have fly. You cannot not select flying as one of the abilities, in which case you may just want to go ahead and put the special movement in for that. But for the alchemical one, we'll just start with the base, and it would be the same way if we're looking at a wizard's or sorcerer familiar, for example. So the rest of this, like again, like the tiny, the size, the senses, movement, and all that, is sort of normal for all familiars. But we want to make sure that these things match up the way they're supposed to. Now, changing these, we notice now the fortitude, reflex, and will saves do match the character. They get to use intelligence for their skills. You'll notice it actually has a better initiative, but since it always acts on you, it's not really all that important. Although there is the ability to have familiars act on their own, I believe they still follow your initiative order. But certainly if you wanted to have a more self-acting familiar, if a GM rules that your familiar is, for all I know, it could be advanced features to let them sort of be their own agents of their own actions. Then maybe having accurate initiatives and all that will be useful. But I want to look at these two things that are a little bit different: the saving throws and the armor class, and how to get those to match up as well. And that comes to the combat tab. Now, in the combat tab, I've already set like unarmored to trained. This will change if and when an alchemist gets different bonuses based on advancement in their defensive proficiencies. But initially, obviously, you're just going to be trained in all these things. And because they also get to reflect, um, their armor class get to reflect what armor you're wearing, that's where you need to pay special attention to the item bonuses here too. So in this case, I think the easiest thing I mean, technically speaking, you come to inventory and just say, hey, whatever I'm wearing, I want to take another one and put studded leather on this familiar, because in essence, it's going to be kind of wearing the same armor as me. But then it kind of means you have to start juggling items on that. Probably the easiest thing to do is just say, hey, if I have any change in armor, rather than dealing with items, just come in here and put the armor bonus here so it reflects the familiar gaining the same armor class as the character that it's bonded to. And that sets your armor class. The other thing is saving throws, to have them reflected accurately, the proficiencies also have to be matching. Now, initially, an alchemist will have expert in fortitude and reflex saves. So I've set in the base familiar to expert in these two categories. And that will be reflected here. As the alchemist raises in levels and you come in and do the familiar level raising aspect, so now you have a level 9 familiar, because it doesn't follow the normal structures of that. When the base alchemist changes its proficiencies in any of these, it will not be reflected over here. So you would have to come in here and let's say Will's now popped up to expert or through feat or just leveling. You would have to come in and change that from T to E to reflect that. In the same way as fortitude reflex, anything changes to a different level of proficiency. So initially though, it'll be set to what a base first level alchemist has, and we'll get you back down to level 1. And that's how you get that to look like the base alchemist, so that when it comes to the necessity to get a fortitude save in, your familiar will be able to roll accurately that based on what the base character has. And just as you level and come in and add levels to here, or if like equipment or anything changes, the base character's scores and anything that doesn't fall out of the familiar rules, which says circumstance and status bonuses aren't affected by it, which is, I believe, why if you were to raise a shield as an alchemist, it's not going to help your familiar. And if you take cover, and similarly, the familiar will not be get the advantage of that unless, of course, the familiar is with you at the time and is benefit from the cover as well. Ooh, drink. So that's how you get kind of the base stuff to work. Now let's take a look at what you can find on the action tab to reflect all the abilities you can choose from as a familiar. To start, you'll get to, I have a little kind of little text field in the spell section here for familiar and master abilities that remind you what the core is. As you add, I don't think alchemists get some of the advanced features that familiars for other classes, and so it may be more applicable for like when the drag and drop wizard comes out. But for the alchemist, you'll see that normally you get to choose 2 abilities on a daily reset, kind of like when you learn your spells and stuff. Your familiar can pick up 2 on a daily basis, and that gives a lot of flexibility for familiars. Maybe some will be your favorites, but there'll be a bunch that, based on circumstances, you may say, well, today I know we're heading into some place that we just need scouting on, so I want my familiar to be able to fly on this day, and you might choose flyer as one of its 2 abilities for that day, which then gives it a fly speed. But what I've done in here is you'll see a spell casting section that lists all the different things available, and I'm taking this in the preparation mode so that you could see that you'll get the base kind of 2 selection circles like you do with spell casting to choose what you might want on a day-to-day basis. So like if you're an alchemist who really likes to have under the master, which is why there's an M in front of this as opposed to the familiar abilities, you really like having the extra reagents that gives you an extra use of that you can then apply to giving you either 2 batched ones to give you for preparing them ahead of time, or an extra one just for some quick alchemy. You can have that selected, and let's say you wanted for this day for your alchemical familiar to be able to fly, you choose that. And if you come to the combat mode, then you could see these are the 2 I have. I can read them real quick to see what they do for this, what the familiar adds for its powers for this day. And this one you can see again an additional batch of infused reagents. That's now listed there. And then if you wanted to come back later and change it, kind of go back to preparation and say, oh, don't need flying today. We're going to be inside a cave, but I would definitely like, and some of these, depending on the familiar, you can only select if you've taken a familiar of the appropriate form, like a plant form familiar. Has to be a plant type before you could take the plant form. But let's say, I talked about this before, you wanted to have an extra skill other than acrobatics and stealth, then you could pick up this extra skill here. Come to think of it, they all use the spellcasting ability modifier. So let's say the character decided he wanted to do this. It would now have these, and then you would come to skills and say, okay, what I really need for my familiar to have today is I want it to be able to be kind of the group, um, let's say lockpick. Although in that case, you instead of having extra reagents, you'd want to pick manual dexterity because they would have to be able to use the tools. So maybe that one wouldn't be as appropriate on this particular selection, but you want it to be able to, you know, brandish some angry looking arched cat kind of back thing, and you want it to be able to have intimidation for this day because you're hoping that the pet might be able to scare people off. Then you would come in here and say, okay, for Alchemist, that's an intelligence one now, and for this day it gets to have intimidation for, or as long as you have that ability selected, and now it would be +7 in that at first level. And then if you were to deselect that later, then you just set this back to nothing. You may even want to set the intimidation back to a charisma ability modifier, but generally speaking, I don't think I use uh, non-skilled things. And you would come here and say, okay, it made use of that, but turns out making things, oops, not standard. Preparation, get rid of that. And it was, I realized that what I really wanted it to do was protect it from some different attacks. So I wanted to have resistance um, to, I think this one allows you to 2 different forms, 2 of the following acid cold. So you could select that, or maybe another decent one to have, I think, is the lifelink one. So if your familiar is attacked and um, might be killed, you can then use a reaction on to protect it and take the damage that it would take, and so it's not reduced to 0. Um, and that's just a way to look at this. Grab these different abilities, have them at hand so you can read them, change them from day to day. Oh, one other thing I should mention up here is class level. Obviously, not going to be 4 to start. I was toying around with that. That does affect some of these powers in here. There's a few that are like it can stand in the shadows. I think one of them is for a shadow familiar. It can stand in the shadows, and for every 10 minutes starts to heal based on um, the, the creature level. In this case, sorry about that. My throat's really tweaking. It heals based on the character level, which this should always match the familiar level up here. I could set some of these a level, but I'd like to use the class level thing because it lets you change it more actively to match. And in here too, I also won't be charisma; it'll be intelligence. None of this that I've seen yet actually uses the kind of the spell rolls, spellcaster abilities, but it doesn't hurt to kind of have it matched up. And if for some, for a familiar that has more than 1 or 2 traits you could use a day, you could change that to 3, and then when you came into preparation mode, you would then see 3 different options to choose from and select. And that's a simple way to do it. But for alchemical familiars, I know they start with 2, and I don't know if there are options to increase that. Probably is. There's a lot out there to be gained. But that's the simple way to see this all out here, to be able to affect things, and to see it at hand really quickly what the options are and what you may or may not want to use on a daily basis with your familiar by making it into a character sheet that reflects what it can and can't do, and it also makes it easier to use on the combat tracker. Again, it's certainly not the only way to do it, but it is one way that I'm going to be including in the drag and drop series especially for classes that normally choose familiars, to be able to go out and grab those and take advantage of the familiar rules that are included with Pathfinder 2. Wow, that was a mouthful. Hopefully it was been some use to people looking to make use of familiars and who are using the drag and drop series, or even if you're not using the drag and drop series and you just want to see how you could do it on your own, um, that's a way to, that's a way you can take a character sheet and turn it into like a familiar, or as we'll see in some of the other series for classes that can have animal companions like a druid or ranger, how you can also do the same thing for companions, animal companions. But we'll all be going over that when we come to those classes. So hope this is of some use to people and you enjoy this, and I'll catch you in the next video.